In the late 18th century, as the sun rose over the savannas of West Africa, one of the most powerful kingdoms on the continent stood at the height of its wealth. Its palaces were built of red earth and carved wood. Its markets echoed with the sound of gold weights clinking against brass scales. Its armies marched in disciplined ranks, armed with muskets, shields, and a confidence born from centuries of dominance. To the outside world, this kingdom looked unbreakable. European merchants crowded its ports and riverbanks, desperate for access. Gold flowed outward, firearms flowed inward. Tribute arrived from conquered neighbors. The king ruled not merely as a monarch, but as the final authority over trade itself. And yet inside the royal courts, something had begun to shift. Not a rebellion, not a famine, not an invasion, but a decision. A single economic choice made in the belief that it would strengthen the kingdom forever. It was a decision about what to sell and, more importantly, what not to sell anymore. Because this kingdom did not fall to superior armies. It was not crushed overnight by colonial conquest. It did not collapse from internal decay alone. It fell because it bet its future on one trade and abandoned all others. And when the world changed, when demand shifted, when moral pressure hardened into military force, that decision turned from strength into a trap. Within a generation, the kingdom's treasury emptied. Its armies weakened, its authority fractured. And the very trade that had made it rich became the lever used to destroy it. This is the story of how an African kingdom fell not from war, but from one trade decision, and how the global economy punished those who adapted too late. Long before its fall, this African kingdom was not a victim of global trade. It was a master of it. For centuries, its power rested on control of land, of people, and above all, of commerce. Gold dust was measured with precision. Ivory moved through carefully regulated routes. Salt, cola nuts, textiles, and agricultural goods flowed across borders that the kingdom enforced with force when necessary. Trade was not free, it was managed. At the center of this system stood the king and his court, acting not merely as rulers, but as gatekeepers. No foreign merchant could trade directly with common people. Europeans, Portuguese, Dutch, British, and later French were kept at arm's length, confined to coastal forts and trading posts. Everything passed through royal intermediaries. This arrangement was deliberate. It preserved sovereignty. The kingdom's wealth did not depend on foreign domination. It depended on leverage. If a European trader wanted gold, he paid in firearms, powder, cloth, or metal goods. If he wanted ivory, he followed the rules or he was expelled. And for a time, this system worked brilliantly. The kingdom grew rich without being colonized. Its armies modernized without losing independence. Its rulers watched European rivalries play out from a position of strength. But global trade does not stand still. By the late 18th century, the Atlantic world was changing. European economies were industrializing. Plantation systems in the Americas demanded labor on a scale never seen before. And European powers were no longer merely traders. They were becoming moral judges, political reformers, and eventually imperial enforcers. Inside the royal court, advisors debated how to respond. Traditional exports gold and agricultural goods were no longer as profitable as before. European demand was shifting. Prices fluctuated. Competition increased. Meanwhile, one trade promised fast wealth, steady demand, and powerful alliances. Human beings. The transatlantic slave trade had already existed for generations, but now it became dominant. And here, the kingdom made its pivotal choice. Instead of balancing trade across multiple goods, the state centralized its economy around one export. Captives taken in war, raids, and judicial punishment were sold in increasing numbers. Firearms flowed in return, reinforcing military dominance and enabling further expansion. It looked like a self-sustaining cycle. More trade meant more weapons. More weapons meant more conquest. More conquest meant more captives. And more captives meant more wealth. From the throne, it appeared rational, even inevitable. But beneath the surface, the economy was narrowing. Skills were lost. Local industries declined. Agricultural production weakened. The kingdom was becoming dependent not on a foreign power, but on a single global demand it did not control. And when that demand vanished, the consequences would be catastrophic. From the outside, the decision appeared brutal. From inside the royal court, it appeared logical. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the kingdom's rulers faced pressures unlike anything their ancestors had known. Regional rivals were arming themselves. European traders arrived with faster ships, more weapons, and harder bargaining tactics. Old trade goods, gold, ivory, agricultural surplus, no longer brought the same leverage they once had. But one commodity never failed to attract buyers. Captives, the Atlantic economy demanded labor relentlessly. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean, cotton fields in the Americas, and mines across the New World consumed human lives at an industrial scale. European merchants did not ask why captives were available. They only asked how many. Inside the court, the argument took shape. Selling captives brought immediate revenue. Selling captives brought firearms. Selling captives discouraged rebellion. Fear traveled faster than law. Most dangerously, it brought predictability. Gold production fluctuated. Harvests failed. Trade routes shifted. But as long as wars were fought and justice was enforced harshly, captives could always be produced. The kingdom did not need to innovate. It did not need to diversify. It only needed to maintain military dominance. So the king made the choice. The state reorganized itself around this trade. Warfare became more frequent and more aggressive. Judicial systems hardened, converting crimes into commodities. Local industries shrank as labor was drained away. Villages emptied, skilled crafts declined. The economy narrowed, but the treasury swelled. To the king, it looked like success. Foreign merchants praised the efficiency. Weapons arrived in bulk. Court rituals grew more elaborate. Tribute flowed upward. But this decision contained a fatal flaw. The kingdom had not merely chosen a profitable trade, it had chosen a politically vulnerable trade. By tying its economy to the sale of human beings, it placed itself at the mercy of foreign moral movements it did not control. Abolitionist pressure in Europe was growing. Laws were being debated. Navies were preparing to enforce new rules at gunpoint. The court underestimated this threat. European powers had tolerated the trade when it suited them. The king assumed they always would. After all, their plantations depended on it. Their merchants profited from it. Their ships grew rich because of it. What the kingdom failed to see was that the same powers who once demanded captives would soon use the abolition of the trade as a justification for interference, blockades, and conquest. When the trade ended, the weapons would stop, the revenue would vanish, and the kingdom would be left with an economy hollowed out by its own success. The decision had been made. There was no easy way back. The collapse did not begin with cannon fire. It began with paper. In Europe, a movement that had once seemed marginal gained unstoppable momentum. Abolitionist groups, driven by moral outrage, religious conviction, and political calculation, forced governments to act. Parliaments debated, laws were passed, treaties were signed. What had once been tolerated commerce was now declared an international crime. For the African kingdom, the shift was sudden and devastating. European ships that had once anchored openly now arrived under different flags, or not at all. Naval patrols began to appear along the coast, not to trade, but to inspect, seize, and punish. The same maritime powers that had fueled the trade now claimed the authority to suppress it. The king protested. From his perspective, this was hypocrisy on a global scale. European wealth had been built on the very trade they now condemned. Their cities, industries, and empires bore its fingerprints everywhere. Yet now they demanded moral obedience from those they had once encouraged. But protests did not stop warships. Blockades tightened. Smugglers replaced merchants, offering worse terms and unreliable access to weapons. Firearms that once arrived in abundance became scarce. Powder prices rose. Maintenance of the army grew difficult. And then the deeper problem emerged. The kingdom had nothing else ready to sell. Gold production had declined. Skilled labor had been drained away for decades. Agricultural output was fragile. Trade networks that once moved diverse goods had withered. The economy had been optimized for one exchange, and that exchange had vanished. Inside the court, panic set in. Advisors argued fiercely. Some urged adaptation, new crops, new exports, renewed trade in palm oil, textiles, or minerals. Others insisted on resistance. Defy the Europeans, continue the trade secretly, fight if necessary. But adaptation takes time, and the kingdom had none. Without trade revenue, the treasury emptied quickly. Soldiers went unpaid. Loyalty fractured. Provincial leaders, once bound by tribute and fear, began to act independently. Some made their own deals with European powers. Others turned against the crown outright. The abolition of the trade did not merely remove income, it removed the glue that held the political system together. The king still ruled, but no longer commanded unquestioned authority. The court still gathered, but its rituals felt hollow. Power leaked outward uncontrollably. And watching all of this were the same foreign powers who had helped create the crisis. They did not see a proud kingdom defending sovereignty. They saw a weakened state, economically desperate and militarily vulnerable. A kingdom that had once dictated the terms of trade now faced terms imposed from the outside. The decision that once guaranteed dominance had become the reason the kingdom could no longer adapt, and this was only the beginning. Economic collapse rarely stays economic. As the flow of trade dried up, the kingdom's internal balance of power began to fracture in ways the court could no longer control. For generations, authority had rested on a simple exchange: loyalty in return for protection, stability, and access to wealth. Once the wealth vanished, that bargain dissolved. Provincial leaders were the first to break ranks. These chiefs and war captains had enforced royal authority in the hinterlands, supplying captives, collecting tribute, and suppressing dissent. Now, with the treasury empty and weapons scarce, the center could no longer reward or punish them effectively. Some began hoarding resources. Others reopened old rivalries. A few reached out directly to European traders and missionaries, bypassing the king entirely. The monopoly of power was gone. Within the capital, tensions hardened into open conflict. Court factions blamed one another for the crisis. Traditionalists accused reformers of weakness. Reformers accused hardliners of clinging to a dead economy. The king's decrees grew harsher, not stronger in attempt to command obedience through fear rather than legitimacy. But fear no longer worked. Among common people, the mood shifted from endurance to resentment. Decades of warfare and raiding had already hollowed out communities. Families had lost sons and daughters to the trade. Fields had gone untended. Crafts had faded. Now, when the promised prosperity collapsed, there was nothing left to justify the suffering. Rebellion did not come all at once. It appeared as desertion, as tax refusal, as quiet sabotage, as villages that simply stopped answering royal summons. Some groups rose openly, rejecting the king's authority and reviving older local identities. Others fled altogether, migrating beyond the reach of the state. The kingdom's borders, once enforced by armyists, became porous and meaningless. Meanwhile, European powers watched closely. They did not intervene immediately, they waited. A fractured state is easier to absorb than a unified one. Each internal conflict weakened the kingdom's ability to resist external pressure. Every rebellion justified assistance. Every breakdown in order became an excuse for protection. By the time the king realized the danger, it was too late. The problem was no longer trade. It was legitimacy. A state that had once drawn strength from controlling commerce now found itself unable to control its own people. Authority had flowed outward for too long, tied to a single source of wealth. When that source vanished, the structure collapsed inward. The kingdom still existed on maps. Its symbols remained. Its rituals continued. But the state itself, the living system of loyalty, power, and consent, was already dying. And the outside world was preparing to finish what economics had begun. The fall of the kingdom did not come as a single moment of defeat. It came as a sequence of agreements. European powers did not arrive first with armies. They arrived with treaties. They offered protection against internal rivals. They offered loans to stabilize the treasury. They offered trade partnerships to replace what had been lost. Each offer came with conditions. Advisors at court argued that these were temporary measure stools to buy time. But time no longer belonged to the kingdom. Every treaty reduced autonomy. Every concession transferred control. Customs duties were capped. Trade routes were opened. Foreign agents were embedded into administration under the language of reform. What had once been a sovereign trading state was becoming a managed territory. When resistance emerged, it was fragmented and poorly armed. Firearms were scarce, ammunition unreliable. The military machine that had once enforced royal will could no longer operate at scale. European forces, backed by industrial supply chains and modern logistics, faced no such limitations. When fighting did occur, it was brief and decisive. Defeated leaders were labeled rebels. Burned villages were called pacification. Confiscated land was declared reform. The king was not always removed. Often, he was preserved reduced to a ceremonial figure, ruling in name, while authority passed quietly to colonial administrators. The symbols of power survived, but their substance was gone. The economy was restructured, where captives had once been exported. Raw materials now flowed out, instead palm oil, rubber, minerals. Infrastructure was built not to integrate the kingdom, but to extract from it. Railways ran from mines to ports. Roads bypassed local markets. Labor was coerced once again, only under different labels. The trade decision that had once enriched the kingdom now completed its transformation. By abandoning economic diversity for short-term dominance, the state had weakened its ability to adapt. When global norms shifted, it lacked alternatives. When pressure came, it lacked resilience. And when intervention arrived, it lacked unity. Colonization did not create the collapse. It exploited it. The empire that replaced the kingdom would later justify its rule as inevitable, even benevolent. But history tells a different story, one of agency, miscalculation, and consequence. The kingdom did not fall because it traded. It fell because it stopped choosing. It allowed one decision to define its future, and when the world changed, it could not change with it. This was not merely the story of a lost African state. It was a warning. When power is built on a single economic pillar, especially one controlled by external demand, collapse is not a question of if, but when.